All right, so I've done the horizontal cuts as are outlined in your brain dissection handout. So our first cut here is just above the Corpus Callosum through the Cingulate Gyrus. And so actually this is the Cingulate Gyrus that we're looking at right here. Okay, so we've cut right through that. So this is the frontal lobe, and as you do these cuts, you'll always, go back and orient yourself. What is front? What is anterior, posterior, and so on. But this is frontal lobe up here, and this is the Cingulate Gyrus. And so, what blood vessel did we see kind of traveling right over the Corpus Callosum by the Cingulate Gyrus? This would have to be a branch of the anterior cerebral artery right here. So there isn't a lot to point out here on this section, except that we can see nicely the distinction between gray matter and white matter. Okay, a lot of white matter here, and up in this kind of more superior horizontal cut, this white matter here is called the centrum semiovale. And that term refers to white matter that is made up of all three types of pathways. So projection pathways that are going to and from the spinal cord to the brain, association fibers that connect right and left hemisphere, and commissural fibers. Okay, you can see I've just cut here a little bit into the top of the lateral ventricle right here. Okay, so that's all I'm going to point out on that one. Let's go to the next section. All right, so our next cut here is through the genu of the Corpus Callosum, and we can see a lot of the Corpus Callosum here. So this portion is the splenium. It'll get larger here as we go down, but I cut through a little bit of the splenium there. We can see interconnecting the occipital lobes. Okay, back here. We can still see the Cingulate Gyrus up here. Okay, so again, any blood vessels you find traveling in this area has to be the anterior cerebral artery. Okay, so frontal lobe here all the way back, and this then is the Sylvian fissure. So again, if you see blood vessels coming out in the Sylvian fissure, this has to be middle cerebral artery, supplying the lateral hemisphere of the brain. All right, so as we look at the lateral ventricles here, okay, the part of the lateral ventricle projecting into the frontal lobe is the frontal, or sometimes called the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay, this whole middle portion here is the body of the lateral ventricle. Okay, and this area back here is the atrium of the lateral ventricle, which the atrium connects the occipital or posterior horn of the lateral ventricle back here with the deeper. If we were to follow this probe and go deep, we'd reach the inferior or temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay, so the atrium kind of connects the occipital and the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle back in this location. All right, so all of this material here is choroid plexus. Okay, again producing cerebral spinal fluid here in the lateral ventricle. Now there's a large nucleus right here. Okay, and as we go deeper down, we'll see the thalamus. Okay, we'll cut through this, and we'll also appreciate that here is the caudate nucleus. So this is the caudate. Caudate is distinctive because it's always bulging into the lateral ventricle. Okay. So here's the caudate nucleus. We can see there is some white matter out here lateral to the caudate nucleus, and in our next cut, we'll see nicely the internal capsule and the different portions of the internal capsule. Okay, so I'm going to point those out later, but as we move out here, we can see there's another little ribbon of white matter here. This is called the external capsule. Okay, there's a little bit of gray matter right there. It's rather faint. This is the claustrum. And then we have another ribbon of white matter right here. And this is the extreme capsule. Okay, we don't make a big deal out of these because we're not sure exactly the function. Okay, but just since they're rather distinctive, we point them out. And then we have a large area of gray matter right here, and all of this is insular cortex. So remember, the insular cortex is buried deep in the brain, deep in the Sylvian fissure right here. Okay, so much of the cortex of the brain is buried deep within these folds. All right. Now as we go back here, we can see there are some myelinated pathways traveling back here to the occipital lobe. Okay, so this is actually part of the optic radiations. Okay, of course we see with the back of the brain. And so this is how vision gets to the occipital lobe for the optic radiations. These optic radiations fan out, I should say, over a large area from the temporal lobe to the parietal lobe. So we're just seeing the upper part of it right here. Okay, we'll go on to the next section. Okay, so I said as we go deeper down, we're going to find this pathway becoming very distinctive. And this is always something you should look for, identify it first, and then find things around it. This is the internal capsule. So the internal capsule has three portions: an anterior limb, a genu or a bend, and a posterior limb. Okay, the posterior limb always has these kind of this striation appearance. That's a little bit distinctive. Okay, and the posterior limb of the internal capsule contains the corticospinal tract. You always want to be aware of where is that pathway. Well, it travels through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. And we also have ascending sensory fibers from the thalamus that are traveling up through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So we have descending motor fibers, the corticospinal tract, and ascending sensory fibers from the thalamus. The genu contains the corticobulbar tract. So the corticobulbar tract is how the brain communicates with the brainstem. Okay, so very important information there. The anterior limb of the internal capsule, a lot of this contains important connections between the brain and the cerebellum. All right, but the frontal eye fields that are important for horizontal eye movements, that also travels through the anterior limb. And Papes circuit. So the part of Papes circuit that goes from the thalamus, here's the thalamus, up to the cingulate gyrus. Here's the cingulate gyrus up here. That goes through the anterior limb of the internal capsule. So there's just a lot of information, a lot of different pathways here that are traveling through the internal capsule. That's really important clinically. So we want to identify what is medial and what is lateral to the internal capsule. So medial to the anterior limb is the caudate nucleus. Okay, so here again we see it bulging into the lateral ventricle. Okay, the caudate nucleus is part of basal ganglia circuitry, very important for movement. So probably the most common condition we'll talk about that involves the caudate nucleus is Huntington's disease. And these patients have a very profound movement disorder. They have chorea, they have uncontrollable movements. Okay, also medial to the internal capsule, this time though to the posterior limb, is the thalamus. Okay, so the thalamus we've referred to as the executive secretary. Any information going to the brain is processed through the thalamus, except sense of smell. Everything else has to go through the thalamus. So vision, sensation, auditory information, you name it, it all relays through the thalamus. Okay, lateral to the internal capsule, we have the putamen. Not very large here, it will get larger as we go further down. The putamen is another important part of basal ganglia circuitry. And the putamen and the caudate actually work closely together. So we call the caudate and the putamen together the striatum. And the striatum is the input nucleus of the basal ganglia. What that means is that when the brain, let's just say the motor cortex out here, talks to the basal ganglia to control movement, it talks to the caudate and to the putamen. This is the striatum. Okay? On the next section we'll see the globus pallidus, and that's the output nucleus of the basal ganglia, but we're too high up to see that. Okay, this pathway right here, we can kind of see this from out lateral to medial. Okay, these are the columns of the fornix. Okay, so remember, this is part of Pape's circuit. So this part of the fornix is taking information from the hippocampus, which we will see in our next section, and it's taking that medially to the mammillary bodies. And so here we can kind of see how the fornix goes from lateral to medial. So again, this pathway, then the fornix would be important for memory circuits, laying down new information. Now there's another much smaller pathway, okay, which really I can only feel confident identifying when I found the vein. And so there's a vein right here. As you can see this space, that's thalamostriate vein. That's not important. It's only important because we can identify the pathway around it. And so the pathway around it right here is called the stria terminalis. We look for the stria terminalis at the base of the caudate. So here's the caudate. So the stria terminalis is right here, and this connects the amygdala with the hypothalamus. So it kind of runs in parallel with the fornix, because the hippocampus is right next to the amygdala. So both pathways are taking information from the temporal lobe, either the hippocampus in the case of the fornix, and the amygdala in the case of the stria terminalis, to the hypothalamus. So the stria terminalis, although small, is important because when we talk about our fight or flight mechanism, when the sympathetics kick in response to something scary that happens, well, that's the amygdala, that's your alarm switch in the brain. And so for the amygdala to activate the hypothalamus, it does so through the stria terminalis. And when the hypothalamus is activated, that's what kicks in your sympathetics, which activates the adrenal gland, and everything else that makes your blood pressure and pulse go up. So that's the importance here of pointing out the stria terminalis. All right, so let's just point out again here that medially we have the caudate and the thalamus, then we have the internal capsule, and then the putamen, and then again we have these white matter pathways, the external capsule, the claustrum, a little bit of gray matter right there, the extreme capsule, so that white matter right there, follow that all the way around, and then finally the insula. There's the insular cortex. And then the space out here again is the Sylvian fissure. Blood vessel in the Sylvian fissure has to be middle cerebral artery. Okay, up here again we have the Corpus Callosum. So above that is the Cingulate Gyrus, which again, remind yourself, look at a sagittal section of the brain and you will always see the Cingulate Gyrus sitting on top of the Corpus Callosum. Okay, we don't see any blood vessels here, at least I can't, but maybe a little bit there. This would be anterior cerebral artery coming out here in the midline. Okay, so again, lateral ventricles, this would be the anterior or frontal horn of the lateral ventricle. And moving back here to the atrium of the lateral ventricle, there's some choroid plexus and the occipital horn of the lateral ventricle back here. Okay, again, we have the splenium of the corpus callosum right here. Okay, and so this is occipital lobe. And we can see again here the optic radiations providing visual information back to the occipital lobe. Okay, last thing I'll point out here is we can see there's some gray matter right there, some neurons. Okay, this is the tail of the caudate. This is what makes neuroscience difficult initially. We have all these C-shaped structures. So the caudate is a C-shaped structure. Here's the head and body of the caudate. Here's the tail of the caudate. Okay, if you do a horizontal section through a C, you're going to see it in two different locations, here and here. So the caudate, tail of the caudate, we will see here as we cut deeper down into the lateral ventricle, and especially as we get down into the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle, we'll see the caudate, tail of the caudate there. All right, so most of the structures here are the same, but there are a couple of new things to point out. First, let's just always start with our internal capsule. So maybe I'll point it out over on this side. So again, we've got our anterior limb, our genu, and our posterior limb. So again, medial to that we have the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. Lateral, last time we had the putamen, but notice, can you see there's a little separation right there? Okay, and that separates the putamen, which is lateral here, with the globus pallidus. Okay, so the globus pallidus, specifically there's an internal and an external part of the globus pallidus, which I think we really can't appreciate here, but it's that internal portion, kind of the medial part of the globus pallidus, which is most of the output of the basal ganglia back out to the motor cortex. So again, the parts of the basal ganglia we've seen so far are the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. So globus pallidus talks back to the motor cortex here through this internal portion. All right, so we can still see the corpus callosum with the cingulate gyrus above, the frontal horn of the lateral ventricle. You can still see some of the columns of the fornix here along the midline. The septum pellucidum is part of this, the non-neural tissue here. It's the septum pellucidum. Again, the thalamus here is really large. You actually can make out some of the individual thalamic nuclei, but I'm not going to do that now. I don't think it's important that you're able to, pick out the different parts here on this section. All right, as we move back here, now we're getting lower down, so this is the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. And one reason I know it's the temporal horn is that the hippocampus curls up into the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. So if possible, I hope you can see that it's kind of curling around like this. Okay, so this is the hippocampus. So remember, from the hippocampus, the columns of the fornix, we saw last time how they went out like this. So it's from the hippocampus to the fornix, and then eventually here we'll come to the mammillary bodies as we get down to the level of the hypothalamus. Okay, so this is the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle, and look, there's some choroid plexus in there. Okay, so above that, then we still have some neurons here. So this is the tail of the caudate. Okay, let me come over to this side now, and let's do the same thing. As we go out from the globus pallidus to the putamen, we can still see our external capsule. Now is, I think, the best look we've had at the claustrum right here. And then the extreme capsule, and then the insular cortex. So there's just a couple things to point out. I did a really thin cut here because I wanted to try to catch the anterior and posterior commissure. So anterior commissure is always really distinctive. You'll not see anything else like this. Okay, where it crosses straight over the midline like this. Okay, so this is the anterior commissure, and we can actually see back here the posterior commissure. But let me point out some surrounding things to give you some orientation there first. Okay, so remember the posterior commissure, I said it always has these kind of striations appearance. And so the posterior commissure, as we go further down, it just changes names. Okay, and around the midbrain we call it the cerebral peduncle. So this is just the continuation of the posterior commissure. It's kind of right at that junction here where it's becoming the cerebral peduncle. So this is just a little bit that's left of the anterior commissure. I'm sorry, the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Here's the anterior commissure. Okay, so what is medial to the anterior limb of the internal capsule? We're still seeing some of the caudate here, and then the putamen is out lateral. So if we kind of follow the anterior commissure back and kind of imagine this going to the temporal lobe out here, crossing over, communicating with the opposite temporal lobe. All right, so this is probably cerebral peduncle. It's hard to tell exactly where the posterior limb of the internal capsule ends and the cerebral peduncle begins, but I think it's cerebral peduncle because we're getting into right here the subthalamic nucleus. Now this will be larger here on our next section, but if you can see this, it's a little football-shaped nucleus right there. And this is where we begin to see it, right at that junction here between posterior limb of the internal capsule and cerebral peduncle. And it's kind of medial right here. So the subthalamic nucleus, it's a low-lying thalamic nucleus, but it's an important part of basal ganglia circuitry. Okay, so again, if we have a lesion here, we have a very distinctive movement disorder, okay, which is known as hemibolismus, where the opposite side of the body has these wild flinging movements. Okay, so we're still in the, most of this is thalamus here, but just a little bit, one section down, we're going to see that this is going to be the midbrain. So maybe that's an important point, that the thalamus sits right on the midbrain. So 1 millimeter, you're in the thalamus. We go just a little bit lower down, and you're in the midbrain. So this is kind of overlapping with the lower part of the thalamus and the upper part of the midbrain. Okay, so here, as I said, is the posterior commissure, important for the pupillary light reflex. And this is the superior colliculus. Okay, the tectum of the midbrain back here. All right. If we move out laterally, here's the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle, and here again is the hippocampus. Tail of the caudate is up in this location. Okay, and out laterally we still have some optic radiations here, providing vision back to the occipital lobe. All right, so the most important thing here is that now we're just a little bit lower, and very clearly now this is midbrain. So the midbrain, remember, has the cerebral peduncles out here. Okay, the tegmentum, which is this whole portion here, and then the tectum back here, which is the superior and inferior colliculus. So let's start here from the cerebral peduncle. Okay, again, has this, all these striations here. Okay, and now the subthalamic nucleus is really large, so you can see it right there. And I'll just point it out over here as well. Okay, kind of football shaped. Okay, and again, think of that as important for basal ganglia circuitry. It's a part of the diencephalon, part of the thalamus, but it's important for basal ganglia circuitry. Okay, here's the red nucleus. Okay, the red nucleus we will discuss. There is an upper motor neuron pathway that originates from the red nucleus called the rubrospinal tract. But the red nucleus is also very important for cerebellar circuitry. So a lot of these cerebellar pathways communicate with the red nucleus. Now notice in between we have some darker staining neurons here. So we're just seeing a little bit of the substantia nigra. So as we go down lower, this should become larger. Okay, so dopamine is produced in the substantia nigra. So we keep coming to different parts of the basal ganglia. Okay, the substantia nigra is in the midbrain, so it's of mesencephalic origin, but in terms of the function, it's part of basal ganglia circuitry. So degeneration here, we know results in Parkinson's disease, a movement disorder. All right, as we move back through the midbrain, we can see there's a little channel right there. So this is the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, around the cerebral aqueduct we have what's called the periaqueductal gray. Doesn't show up very well here, but this is, we know, has abundant opioid receptors and is important for pain control. Okay, and then again we have the tectum of the midbrain back here. All right, if we move out laterally, again we have the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle with choroid plexus. So kind of on the floor of that, we have the hippocampus curling up here. And then kind of above the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle, we have the tail of the caudate. Okay. Now I think what we're seeing here is just a little bit of the optic tract. Okay, coming out here. This is not a great example of it, but the lateral geniculate nucleus is out in this location, but this does not have the classic Napoleon's hat, so that's not a great example of a lateral geniculate. But this is the optic tract here, which provides vision to the lateral geniculate, and then the optic radiations fan out from there. Okay. All right, so we're one section lower in the midbrain now, and one thing that should stand out is that we've got a pretty healthy substantia nigra there. But pretty clear this individual did not have Parkinson's disease because there are a healthy number of dopamine producing neurons that we can see there. So in this section we can still see the cerebral peduncle. Okay, now the substantia nigra. Now we're just below the red nucleus, and if you can appreciate, there's some white matter pathways right here. Okay, this is it's called the decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so this will make sense when we do the wiring pathway diagram of the cerebellum. But when the cerebellum talks back to the motor cortex, it sends that information through the superior cerebellar peduncles. And these cross, so the right and the left cerebellar information crosses right here in the midline. That's why it's called the decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, the only other thing I'll point out, there's other neurons that are darkly staining here other than the substantia nigra, and this is back here around the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, this is the locus ceruleus, and this is where norepinephrine is produced. Okay, so it's in this dorsal part of the midbrain, kind of around the cerebral aqueduct. Now if we move out here into the temporal lobe, one other important thing to point out. So this again is the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. So we've been pointing out the hippocampus kind of in the floor of that all the way up. Okay, but now notice if we move up here, we've got a homogeneous mass of neurons. Okay, and this is the amygdala. How do we know it's the amygdala? Well, this is the uncus. Remember, the uncus lies right next to the cerebral peduncle. The third nerve, remember, comes out right here. We can't see the third nerve here, but the third nerve lies right adjacent to the uncus as it exits the midbrain. Okay, so this is the uncus, and the amygdala is just lateral to the uncus. Okay, so we've got these two important structures here in the temporal lobe. Remember, the amygdala communicates with the hypothalamus via the stria terminalis. The hippocampus communicates with the mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus via the columns of the fornix. All right, now let me just show one last thing here. I made one more cut into the pons. We're still seeing some of the locus ceruleus here. Okay, but just appreciate here these horizontal fibers in the pons. Okay, and they're moving out into this myelinated pathway here. This is the middle cerebral peduncle. Okay, so the pons is continually sending information to the cerebellum here through the middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so I think we'll stop there with our horizontal sections, and we'll move on to some coronal cuts.